So without further ado, Amble, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask Clarence to screen share on his computer laptop, and while he's getting his patch up so that Eleanor can see it, I'll talk very quickly about what we do and who we are. We are disabled musicians. Sorry, the computer's asking me questions that I don't want it to ask me. We are a group of disabled musicians, and we have been collaborating online and rehearsing and playing together over Zoom. This started out before the pandemic as a project that I was working on to support housebound disabled musicians, because we would very rarely get to see each other, and we wanted to find a way to play together. And after about a year of figuring this stuff out, the pandemic happened, and boom, everyone was doing it, and so it kind of knocked us for six a little bit. It knocked our research project out of the water a bit because it suddenly just became very mainstream. So we work with a captioner called Eleanor Charnley. We have two hearing impaired people in the ensemble who use the captions, and Eleanor transcribes what she makes of the music in a kind of poetic form. So she's very much an artistic collaborator with us as well. And we all react off each other in a kind of networked way. So we use the patterns of the speech in Clarence's sampler, which you'll see on the screen. It's just something that I've made for Clarence, which he can control with his head mouse, which is a tube which he controls with his mouth. And we respond to both the context and the meaning of the words, but also the rhythm and pitch and the melody of the words. And we have Steph West on harp, Sonia Elori on clarinet and EWI. We have Claire Johnston on iPad. Shelley Knotts is here on live coding, and I've got my electric violin with processing. And Clarence is on laptop, and he's going to start us off. So yeah, Clarence, when you're ready, let's play some tunes.
By the grace of God. It's the phrase, isn't it? Part of extra admin involved in being disabled. Is such a palaver. Is such a palaver.
People are afraid. People are afraid of disability. People are afraid of impairment. also don't want to kill you. I want to go out now.
Someone looked at me dead in the face and said, if I was you, I'd kill myself. And so from there's my point. They thought this was a compliment, like
I think I had to master a lot more and push myself a lot more.
Then there is value to the person who helped.
People are afraid. People are afraid of disability. People are afraid of abandonment. lot of work, a lot of graphs, and a lot of pain, a lot of anxiety is to give what you do here, able-bodied conditions visible to people.
Out of expert admin involved in being disabled, admin involved in being disabled, admin involved in being disabled.
Oh, you want to train? Oh, you better get before hallucinosis.
I'm sorry if that ran over a bit. We were just having too much fun.
No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Thank you. I'm sure I switched the thingy spotlight. Sophie, you seem to be on it with the spotlight thing. Can we?
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out which Amble was the one to spotlight because there's two.
Yeah, there's
there's
several kind of multiple personalities going on. Which is...
Hang on, I'll put myself back on laptop and I'll leave with my phone.
Thank you.
Hello.
What? Oh, heavens above. What button should I be pressing to get back to? Is someone still sharing this? I think is Clarence still sharing the screen?
Yeah, Clarence, can you stop sharing your screen, Poppet? Okay, thank you.
There we go. Thank you, thank you. Wow, that was quite something.
We've definitely stolen too much of the slot.
No, not at all. Not at all. Don't worry. Well, we started a little late. So, oh, bless you, goodness.
Sorry.
And again. Fully recovered? Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, we're combining the Q&A at the end of the session. So if that's okay, we will come back to you then, if that's right. So a reminder for everyone else, pop your questions in the chat window and I will then transfer them back to the chat window when we get that point in the proceedings. So wonderful. So now I'm going to hand over to Mark Iyengar and Anne Stimson. Mark and Anne, are you ready to go? Are you there?
Hold on.
Let's have a look. There we go.
Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Anne Stimson, and this is my partner, Mark Iyengar.
Iyengar, my pronunciation was wrong, sorry.
Sometimes known as Ange, he answers to both, so that's fine. We are the founding members of the Sonic Arts Ensemble. which is based at the Advanced Center for Art and Design at The Ohio State University. From the beginning, our ensemble was focused both on traditional instruments and live computer processing, so that the sound you hear would originate from traditional instruments, even though they might sound very electronic. We like to play with the idea of the real and the imagined, and also the idea of the physicality of sound. One way we do that is to have the sound originate from the traditional instrument and then process them electronically in real time. Another way we deal with the physicality of sound is to work in multi-channels so that the sound is traveling through space. We've experimented with a number of creative processes for generating form. Some of our work is completely scored, some partially scored, some partially improvised, some fully improvised, and some a combination of these things. We are an interdisciplinary group working with video, dance, movement, and theater. And Mark will tell you a little bit about the Max patches.
Okay, thank you. So we do deal with both traditional instruments and electronic instruments as sort of the part of what we do. So I'm going to share a screen here. And you can see this is an example of the giant Max patch we've been working on over many years. So that there's a lot of processing that you can do. Real instruments come in here. Real instruments. I don't know what a real instrument is. Well, for instance, a flute would come in here, and you could process it in real time. This is sort of one of the fundamental ideas that we had. We have changed that now so that we have some instruments that are purely electronic, but they're like game controllers, so there's still some physicality involved. We started off by playing in we've been playing a long time, so we started off by playing in a traditional sort of black box setup. So I'll show you a little clip of that, and I'm going to have to stop sharing and re-share with computer sound this time. I always forget the computer audio thing. Okay, it's in stereo. Good. So here's just a little clip of something we did pre-pandemic. So the people with the iPads are the ones who are processing the sound of the people playing flute and cello. They're paired together. Then I'm sort of a front of the house mixer in front there. And you can tell there's lots of silence. So that's the type of thing we did before the pandemic, and then the question was, what are we going to do once we could no longer meet in person? So for us, the question was always, what is the highest quality sound that we can put together? And I thought immediately of Jack Tripp, and then there was really a lot of international work done towards Jack Tripp and software like Jack Tripp. So so that the idea was that everyone was sort of working towards the same question. And we went through a lot of iterations of things, but eventually we settled on Nettie McNetface, which some of you may know. It's a version of Quack Trip that Miller Puckett created. We also worked with Jack Tripp. It took us a long time to work with our university to set up port forwarding, which is always the big problem for everyone. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds with the technical stuff, so I'll just say that one of the big first questions for us was the question of access. So with everyone no longer at the universities or any institution like that, the question is, where you are, can you even make sound? Are you in a safe place? In that place, can you make sound? For everyone I knew, they eventually got to a safe place, and eventually some of them got to places where they could make sound, but not all of them. So we had, for instance, a sax player who had this huge sound, and that sax player was also very interested in electronics, so we figured out a way of making a hybrid sax electronic instrument so that he could play that and not bother his neighbors, and it actually worked out quite well. It's one of the most interesting instruments I've ever heard. He plays it really well. I can say that because it's him playing, not me, right? Okay, so there's this question about access. Once we settled on those, we really had this idea of, let's use this as an opportunity rather than a problem. So we have to still acknowledge that there are problems, but we want to think about how can we use this in the most as a medium by itself, not as sort of a impoverished way of creating concerts. So we wanted to explore the medium itself. So one thing I've thought of is there's really two problems that you have. One is connecting musicians, and we settled on high quality connections because when you actually connect with somebody with the best quality sound, there's a presence that you feel. It's like you're in the room with that person, actually. To me, it's like you're in the room with that person. So that's why we like to use Jack Tripp or some kind of a variant of it. Latency is a problem, and it's addressed to some extent, but we're connecting with people in Argentina, we're connecting with people in Austria, we're connecting with people throughout the United States. So, you're going to have latency anyway. So really for us, we wanted to have the best quality audio. It gives you this presence that you can really feel the other person there. So, and then we wanted to get out of this Zoom box idea. So we looked at a couple of different ways of doing that. The first thing we decided was we wanted a front of the house mixer for both audio and video, because that's what you would have in a regular concert. So people don't think about the streaming access, the streaming part of it. So there's two parts really, the performance part, and then there's a part where you're streaming. And they're really separate parts that work together. So if you're just playing with each other, you don't have to worry about the streaming part. But if you want to actually have an audience, then you have to figure out how you're going to stream. And that brings in another completely, a complete different set of problems. And it also, it makes it so that you approach the problem in a different way also. We found that when we were just getting together and playing, it was more informal, and we could try a lot of experimental things, so we tried a lot of things. At a certain point, we just decided that, okay, let's put on a show, and at that point, You can elect to continue to be experimental, but you have to be experimental in a way that, you know, when your audience connects, they're going to see something. They're not going to say, oh, this looks stupid, the audio keeps popping out and things like that. So I'll show you some early things that we did, and then I'll play a longer piece. So I'm going to share a screen again. And let me check the audio. Took me a year to find the stereo audio button on here. Now I finally found it. By the way, here's sort of this is an overview of how things happen. So here's the musicians. They go to the jack trip server. Jack trip server sends sound back to the musicians so that they can hear each other. Musicians go to video. We can use Zoom, but we prefer to use something like Jitsi, or now we're using OBS Ninja actually. And then it goes to vMix or OBS. And so this is where the front of the house mixer would be, and then the result goes out to the audience. So I'll show you some little clips. This is the first clip we did. The other question we had to ask is, where are we? Are we, so to quote Alvin Lucier, are we sitting in a room? This is the question. So we started thinking, well, at first we'll just show us setting up in our regular spaces, like we're doing a regular concert. So you'll see one of our engineers just setting up equipment in our regular black box space as if he were going to set up for a regular concert. Then it switches to the telematic part, and you can see how it goes. We call this into the multiverse because it starts in our regular spaces, then goes into this multiverse. So I'll just show you clips of this.
Three, two, one.
And then I'm going to fast forward it. Joe Sfera played a piece last time. We have a little, I'll play a little end of excerpt from his piece that goes into a larger piece that we did. And you can see how we're going from a Zoom grid into our individualized audio videos. Okay, so those were some early things that we did. Now I'm going to go ahead and play an extended clip of one of the most recent works that we did. it also involves someone who is doing live visuals while we play, and the visuals are being sort of weaved in and out. The first one is one group, and the second one's the same group with slightly different people, and I'll play this long excerpt and then a little bit of the excerpt after it. But again, the idea is that we have this front of the house mixer who's doing a lot of the mixing for the audio and also for the video. And these are people from Austria and also throughout the United States and Argentina. So I'm going to stop there just to give you some idea there. We can talk in the Q&A. There's some questions about cost and things like that, and I think those things are good things to talk about because we are talking about accessibility. I would say that bandwidth is not as much of an issue as we thought it would be at first, and as much of it as it should have been at first, because again, a lot of people have been working very hard on that issue. Jack Tripp Foundation now allows you to connect to their servers in a lot of different places for free. We did have trouble getting our own IT people to set up servers, so at first we were using peer-to-peer technology, and we sort of hacked our own peer-to-peer technology. But these are all people connecting from their own houses, and what we had to do is basically convince everybody to create their own television studios in their own houses. So you can see we have a little television set up there. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can tackle some of the questions in the Q&A.
Mark, thank you. That was truly wonderful. I'm looking forward to getting back to some of the questions that we've been posted about this. I have some of my own I'm looking forward to asking you as well. So thank you so much for that. Truly wonderful. We move on to our last presentation of the final session. Randall, the floor is yours.
Yes,
the
hello,
screen, the floor, the stage.
And good morning.
Any all of the above. There we go.
This side of the Atlantic as well. Am I coming through?
Loud and loud and clear.
Loud and clear. I'm gonna share my screen here. I mean, this is really looks like a wonderful conference. I'm told Steve earlier, I regret that I couldn't attend more of the sessions. I've been traveling. Just got in last night, actually driving across the United States. But it's been wonderful to hear the participants I've been sharing with here. I think, I mean, Amble and your ensemble and kind of the multimodal cohesion that you brought together is really outstanding. And Mark and Ann and the sound clarity with your work is wonderful as well. So I'm sorry to say I don't have as much video and audio to share with you today. It's going to be mostly a spoken talk about the work we've been doing. But I have a couple excerpts that I hope come through. Let me get this started here. So I'm going to talk about this kind of the first phase and performances of this project that I've been collaborating with to develop. And it's only me today. My collaborators, I have to say, are they're in Sweden, and apparently today is midsummer, or yesterday and today, and that's the big raucous bacchanalian fest of some sort. I don't understand. But they couldn't be here today, but I'm happy to present. The only downside is that of all of our group, I'm kind of the theorist in the group, so I'm afraid I won't be able to answer more technical questions about networking and audio design, but I'll do my best if you have any. But let's see. So I first want to talk a little bit about hyper organs, which is kind of the instrument, if you will, that we're dealing with this project. And if you don't know, there's been kind of a growing hyper organ community, a growing group of organists, musicians, performing artists, but also organ builders, people who are just interested in electronic music and interface design, but also musicologists and researchers. And it's, I mean, this is, for this crowd, this is all familiar stuff. Of course, hyperorgan is after, the hyper instruments that coined by Todd Mackover and been developed for, going on 30, almost 40 years now. But of course, these are organs with external digital interfacing, right? So at the very least, these are organs that have, MIDI in and out, and in some cases, OSC capabilities. Or in some cases, just internal extended performance capabilities. I won't go into it, but there's some new organ interfaces where you're sitting at an organ console and you actually have a touch screen, and you could draw on the screen combinations of pipes and notes and set up loops and do all sorts of other things that most pipe organs can't do. But one of the big discussions amongst this group is, what is a hyper organ exactly? Does it mean anything with these capabilities? And it's been proposed, I proposed that it should mean something more. Something that really compels new negotiations, as I say, of sound, space, and action. Should negotiate new musical processes, right? Music as process. And more into that in just a little bit. But most of this work has been centered around Orgelpark in Amsterdam. if you're unfamiliar, Orgel Park is it's an institute that's affiliated with VU Amsterdam, Free University Amsterdam. But it's its own independently funded institute. It's in a deconsecrated church, and it has organs left, right, and center all over the building. And they fund concerts all year round until, of course, this past year, and organ research, and an annual symposium, which is kind of the big anchor of the hyperorgan community, where everybody comes together, this year virtually, but people come together and talk about these issues. There are a growing number of these hyperorgans around the world. Of course, Amsterdam, Piteå, Sweden, at the Luleå, Piteå School of Music of Luleå University. And in Malmö, a new wonderful organ with big touch screens and 6 keyboards, just finished. Stavanger, Norway, and several in Germany. Montreal, the new concert hall, somewhat new now, concert hall in Montreal, their instrument has some wonderful capabilities. And they've done a concert where they've had the Canadian astronaut, the International Space Station, has played the organ live during the concert, things like that. So, I mean, there are many others with these interfaces, and there are 4 or 5 more major kind of hyperorgans already being developed, so it's a growing community, mostly in Europe, hopefully more in North America here, and hopefully more in Asia soon. A complete list of hyperorgans worldwide with these capabilities is forthcoming. We're working on that project. So in the future, hopefully the idea is that anybody who's unfamiliar with the organ could get this database and see what instruments are in the area that have these capabilities and how do they network, how do they connect, and you could start planning and use these instruments. And so this brings us to the Global Hyperorgan Project. It's proposed in 2017 at an Orgel Park symposium. And it's a network for real-time acoustic music interaction over a distance, telematic acoustic musicking. And the original idea was it would be only acoustic sound, so no microphones, no speakers. But as we'll see, that's been expanded a bit. It was inspired in part by Atao Tanaka's Global String, which you may be familiar with, and which had a string from one corner of the room to the other, and they had a similar setup somewhere else in the world. And participants could vibrate and tactilely touch the string and make sound in embodied physical ways, and that would actually vibrate the strings on the other side, as if you had a string kind of going through the earth and you're connecting with one another in real time. And so the global hyperorgan is, you could think of it as kind of organs around the world that are connected telematically with virtual trackers and wind trunks kind of running through the earth, as if you're taking these existing pipe organs and making a huge worldwide pipe organ. You could use video projection, much like Global String. Could ground the spaces in kind of extended reality between the two, as of course everybody's been doing with telematic music. There's open mapping between the locations. If you know anything about organs, you know you have thousands of pipes and they're organized by sound and pitch. But of course the mapping from what your action in one location to the pipes and pitch in the other location is wide open. It doesn't mean you have to play one stop here and it activates a similar stop there. Of course it could do that. So the mapping process itself I've described as a compositional space. So when you sit down and you want to make a global hyperorgan event, connecting instruments and perform in real time, it's that mapping that's the actual composition of sorts. That's at least the start of the compositional space. And in the sense, the global hyperorgan, it's not really an instrument, but it's a platform for the creation of shared instrumentality. So this brings us back to the question, what is hyper about the hyperorgan and the global hyperorgan? And I take as inspiration, to some degree, Timothy Morton's concept of hyperobjects, which are objects which strain our understanding of the world. They're objects and processes or experiences which compel new modes of thought and new language. His quintessential example is climate change. Such a huge span of time and such an intricate connection with every aspect of our humanity kind of blows our minds, and we could see that in kind of the politics of climate change, which Bruno Latour kind of lays out recently. Hyperorgans, so the question is, how do they compel new engagements with ecologies of acoustic musicking? And I take ecology as, I use the term ecology to describe how we situate and find our instrumental niches based on Gibsonian ecological psychology. So you'll find that, I'll use that metaphor quite a bit. So the global hyperorgan really compels artists to reevaluate the temporal relations, right, because of latency, between the two participants, collapsing or more participants. So it collapses psychic and social time and space in a very unique way. It's much like other telematic musicking, of course. This has been going on for decades and been discussed for quite some time, but the emphasis on acoustic sound production from fixed instruments in defined spaces is maybe a little bit unique to the global hyperorgan. And so performers have to focus on navigating the affordances for sound and, of course, the constraints of latency in order to embody a compelling intersubjective habitus, right? And from which they develop this discursive voice, which is a process of collaboration between performers. And this is outlined in Gorton and Oosterjo's work from the Orpheus Institute in 2019. So the global hyperorgan, in a sense, is geographically heterogeneous, but the aim is to be ecologically homogeneous. So as if you're playing organs in multiple areas, but as if you're in one unified space. Much like Mark's performance we just heard, the sound was so glorious. It sounded like they're all right there in one room working together. But of course, it's acoustic sounds. It's a very different situation. So in kind of a bigger picture about the Global Hyperorgan Project, it's meant to be an expansive, inclusive network, as I say, for new ecologies of acoustic musicking. So it'll bridge geographic and cultural divides. The idea is that this is not for organists. Organists can participate. You can sit at the organ and do this, but it's really for any variety of musicians, artists, or even non-musicians. It's a space. It's using instruments that exist. These voices of the pipes that are out there that have already been built. To bring people together through music. So you can imagine public spaces around the world. I'd love to see every concert hall here in North America or around the world connected to Global Hyperorgan. They could plug in and create events connecting the public or children or people of all abilities, communicating with each other through the voices of the pipes in different locations around the world. There's also it demands post-colonial exploration, which has opportunities for empowerment through connecting colonial era organs that are out there around the world, which are now, part of those communities. And it invites them in to use this space and empower them to connect with other musics around the world, from connecting their local musical practices to other musical practices. So it's not even just about Western or art music or anything like that. It's really looking in a broader sense. And so, as I said, it's a telematic artificial reality mediation within the analog acoustic world. And in a sense, in these actions, it collapses the global and the local in a new, what I call a hyper-global musicking. And I won't go into it now, but I kind of base this idea off Latour's reorientation of the poles of global and local that is demanded by climate change for a new terrestrial politics. And I think this telematic hyper-acoustic musicking has a similar demands a similar change in our thoughts about what musicking and modernity is in musicking, and pulls us towards more terrestrial musicking together, even through Zoom for virtual musicking. But I want to talk about really the test today. So this is the first major test of this setup occurred in January 2021. Featured an ensemble that they call themselves a TCP IP ensemble. These are my other 4 collaborators on this paper. And they're 4 faculty and students from the research cluster GEM research, which is Gesture, Embodiment, Machines, and Music at the Luleå University of Technology in Sweden, or really at the Piteå School of Music, if you know that area, which is another town an hour away, up in the northern subarctic of Sweden. And so what they did is they set up a 2-way network between 2 organs. So between the Studio Acusticum organ in Sweden, up there, and the Utopa Baroque organ in Amsterdam. And I just want to make a quick note about this Utopa Baroque organ. If you're unaware of this, it's unusual in that it's a hyperorgan. It's networkable, has OSC control systems, has a new interface by a German company called Sinua. So it's not just the usual organ with kind of buttons and combinations. It's a complete touchscreen interface. But what's unusual is that it's also an 18th century reconstruction. It's a process research reconstruction, which created an instrument of the likes that Johann Sebastian Bach would have known. So this means it's a process. We're talking about music as process. So this is an instrument as process, in that they went and reconstructed what does it mean to make an organ at that time, using the materials, the procedures, the hand-forged steel, the wood glue, the rabbit glues that they used, and the paints from that time period, really creating an organ from the ground up, not to sound like a historic organ, but just building an organ using those techniques, those materials, cultures. And so it's very unique that you have this historic, really historic organ that is also a hyper organ. But back to the test. So all 4 performers were actually situated in one hall. So they were all in Piteå, Sweden. And performance data was sent simultaneously to the organ in their space and the organ in Amsterdam. And the sounds of the organ in Amsterdam were projected into the hall. So projected diffused in the hall, I should say, not through headphones. I believe. I might be wrong about that. So this is a bit of a departure from the purely acoustic original vision for the global hyper organ, but it offered some opportunities for some interesting tests, and it really proved that that dichotomy between acoustic and digital is really a spectrum, right? It's something that could be deconstructed in a way. I mean, what is a speaker, a loudspeaker after all? And I mean, how is that any less than a musical instrument? This vibrating physical surface that's vibrating the air. And so, of course, the organ, if you know about pipe organs, are inherently modular. I mean, the history of the organ is about modularity, literal physical modularity. You have big chunks of pipes here and chunks of pipes there, and they're connected through some interface, and you have to select it through, and you select the modules of the organ through first mechanical means and later through electronic means. But it's also akin to an acoustic modular synthesizer, right? It's a very similar effect. And so modularity, as of course you all know, is intrinsic to ensemble electroacoustic and even telematic musicking, right? And we can look back at, of course, as far back as the League of Automatic Composers in Mills College, where Perkis and Bischoff talk about, here quote, they approach the computer network as one large interactive musical instrument made up of independently programmed automatic musical machines. And so modularity as intrinsic to the ensemble electroacoustic and musicking is also observed, I think, interestingly in Denise Peters' work, referring to a collaboration with Bennett Hogg and Sabine Vogel. Peters observes how the interconnections between the members takes on an almost physical shape and distributes control structures and affordances among them. And he says, whenever an instrument is played by multiple performers, when also its bodily extensions are multiple, then a compound sound, or even a single sound, as in the present example, might become the result of joint intentionality. It's shared instrumentality. He describes this distributed or shared instrumentality as an added fourth player. Describes it as, quote, a fourth semi-autonomous voice that suggests that next to the separate instruments, the interconnectedness of the instruments create a new instrument, one producing that fourth voice. And so the quartet featured an electric, it wasn't an organist in this quartet, featured a performer on an electric guitar, a hyper clarinet, one dedicated to live coding, and another on a laptop with gesture interfacing. And so the live coder developed a framework with Super Collider, and the objective was to express musical ideas in a minimal but efficient way. And he points out, this is Matthias Petersen, he points out that human latency is an inherent feature in live coding. So in live coding, you have to hear what's happening and physically type something in and make it happen. There's a latency involved. But it can be reduced by mapping certain parameters to physical controllers or using other performers' live input. As he says, achieving more complexity with less typing. And the input from a MIDI guitar was used to define the scales for a running arpeggiator, and this constitutes an example of shared instrumentality. So the live coder can write patterns of arbitrary length and use algorithms to set combinations of singular or multiple note degrees, quantized to the currently stored scale from the guitar. So I have an example here. Let me make sure I'm sharing audio. Excuse me one second. Where would that be? Share computer sound. Okay. Hopefully this will come through. Give me a signal or send me a chat if this doesn't come through. I'll just stop it there for now. One second here. Okay. So the shared instrumental, talking about the hyperclarinet and shared instrumentality. Other musical parameters could be decoupled from the typing interface of the live coder via sensor data, which is sent wirelessly to the clarinet, to the live coding system. And so the Euler y-axis, the pitch angle, quote unquote, derived from the sensor on the clarinet bell, was used to set the gate time for note events played on the organ, and thus allowed the clarinets to shape articulation by controlling the length of notes in the running patterns generated through the live coding. So here is a diagram of this modular system, or at least one of the modular systems, and it could be remapped and reconfigured. Check my time here. Don't want to go too long here. But I'll give you a chance to look at this. You can see how the MIDI guitar is sending information into the live coding, and the clarinetist on the other side is sending a gate length to the live coder, but also adjusting the wind speed in the organ, so adjusting kind of the tuning of the organ pipes, and all of that is going to the acousticum organ. And the laptop performer on the right, as you may have noticed, he interacts with two modular systems. First comprises a sound corpus of Aeolian sound recordings, which is like long string resonances. And the live audio signal coming from the electric guitar played by the guitarist and the organ in Amsterdam. The connections between these elements in the system are reconfigured live. And you can see that here. So the electric guitar, audio is fed into the Aeolian guitar corpus, which is fed into the Baroque organ, which actually plays the pipes of the organ. And down below you can see the gesture movement, which goes through various stages of data, looping, and artificial intelligence work here. So talking about that just briefly. So the second modular system comprises of this motion sensor. And it says that an artificial intelligent agent in the form of a reinforcement learning algorithm uses this small version of the FMA dataset as a second audio corpus. And it was dedicated to the creation of rhythmic patterns in the system. So I'll just jump to this brief excerpt here. Not to go too long here, but you can see the two instruments here on the screen. And one more example here. They found that this interplay within the system reveals not only this sense of shared instrumentality, but this notion that Peters talks about of this new agent, right? So in this sense, a fifth agent. And one more brief excerpt here. I hate this stuff. I could listen to that all day. But talking about this, just to get into this final point here, the fifth agent, this what we've just called this indeterminate space. It's emergent from how the different timbral qualities of the two organs generated a variable perception of space. So once it's geographically heterogeneous, they're here and there, they're two organs, but at times they exhibit an indeterminate homogeneity because they're not the same sound. It's a very different kind of organ between the two. And the performers navigate this indeterminate space by shifting their listening in ways that transport them beyond the resonant body of the organ within their physical space. And as I said, they inhabit a liminal perceptual and gestural presence. So in this case, Peter's notion of an added player, a fourth agent, becomes an indeterminate space that's neither between nor an amalgam of the two organ spaces. And they're the two disparate geographical and acoustic spaces. But it's a novel space affording new collaborative agency. And this inspired the IP in the ensemble's name, TCP/IP, IP for indeterminate space. And so understood as a modular system, the quartet becomes an example of how human and non-human agents can interact to form new and unexpected dynamic configurations. Variable networking of agents and mediators are emblematic of the intersectionalities of the technical, artistic, and social at the heart of the global hyperorgan project, and they're illustrative of the thick and pervasive mediating dynamics that we all know that are mediate the process of musicking at all levels. The global hyperorgan, in summary, it's a rich space for artistic production and research. Talking about cybernetic systems, won't dwell on these too much, but unique capacities for that hyperacoustic collaboration, like I mentioned, and that global hyperorgan participants must contend with the process of constructing new models of instrumentality for new modes of hyperacoustic musicking. And I won't get into future work too much, but the next stages involve more data collection through the GEM cluster in Sweden. And they recently we presented a paper, I should say, at the NIME conference last week, 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, and a performance. And the TCP/IP ensemble, I should mention, won the performance award at the NIME festival, which was really nice. I could brag on their behalf because I wasn't involved in the performance, so I had nothing to do with that. So it was wonderful work that they've been doing with these new affordances between the organs. And they just performed the symposium last week, the Hyperorgan Symposium, a performance between 3 organs all at once. And the future of the global hyperorgan is going to further develop this system with more musicians, not just this ensemble, but we've already have other groups working with us to explore technology, agency, voice, space, and intersubjectivity in hyperacoustic telematic musicking. So this really marks the end of kind of phase 1 of this project, and I wanted to share that with you, and happy to answer any questions during our discussion. Thank you. Stop my sharing. Here we go.
Thank you, Amble. Gosh, what a lot to think about. We'll move on to the Q&A, if that's okay, I think. Put myself back together. There we go. Now I can see everybody, rather than just me. Right, so back to the beginning of session 6, which was Amble. Let me just grab the questions for you. There, hang on, bear with me a split second. I'll pop the comments in first, and then I'll get to the question.
Yeah, there was somebody asking about where we obtain the sounds, Grant Glover, so I could just reply to that one.
Yes, hang on, I will throw that into the window for the benefit of everybody, or is Sophie already on the case? Sure.
The samples that were in Clarence's sampler were taken from interviews that I did. I made an opera with Toria Banks called We Ask These Questions of Everybody, and it was about half of it was a real live transcript of a PIP interview, which is the new name for disabled living allowance, and it was a real transcript that somebody gave to us. And we notated it and it was sung. And then the other half of the opera kind of interspersed with that were interviews with disabled people. So I interviewed, I think, 26 people for about an hour each. And then we picked samples out of that. And Clarence played the samples in the opera as well. He had 4 different samplers in the opera, depending on where we were, because we can only put 28 in at a time. So he's got control over them. then he chose the ones that he wanted for this performance. So I think one of the things I really like is that the power in the group is kind of moved around. So usually as a composer, or I was the composer of the opera, I would have, and Toria as the librettist would have control, and we would tell people what to play. But in this case, Toria chose about 30 samples for each chorus, and then Clarence had them in his sampler, and he could choose to play them in any order that he wanted. He could just play one over and over again, or he could layer them up, or he could play them really sparsely. So we tried to just give that power away, but also give away the power of what even is being said by interviewing other people. And there is an editorial process, obviously. We cut bits out of people's interviews, but once we'd cut them, we sent all the cuttings back to the interviewees and asked them to give us permission to use them, and whether they just wanted their voices used or whether they just wanted the text used with somebody else reading it. Yeah, it's kind of about dispersal of power, I guess. For those comments were not chosen by us, they were spoken by other people, and they were then chosen by Clarence and played by Clarence.
Fascinating. Which kind of actually leads on, let me just double check in case someone else has thrown something in.
I think that's probably...
Oh, hang on there. Yes. I don't know who posted this, but I can't see from... I'm going to put that in, and whoever it is, I think it's just read my mind. Can you talk about the participatory? Yes, that was kind of pretty much word for word what I was going to ask.
Yeah, it didn't quite work out. I think we all got a bit flustered because we were trying to set up in the breakout room, and then the captions didn't work. And I didn't really explain it properly. But again, it's about handing power outwards. So there's like a network of the ensemble. So Clarence is responding to the comments which were made in the interviews, and then Steph is responding to Clarence, and Sonia's responding to Eleanor's responding to Steph and to Clarence, and it sort of sets off this chain of events, and it's sort of not clear who's responding to who in the end. It becomes this kind of flexible network, which we took from sort of disability theory and culture. This sort of idea of a flexible network, so we don't have a system which is set with one person telling other people what to do, but everybody is able to contribute what they want to contribute when they want to contribute it, which is more of a kind of disability studies way of thinking about things. So the Twitter thing came in from so much of disabled culture has been aided and supported by social media. We've found networks, we've found support groups, we've found ways of organising, we found out about things that are going on all over the world, we've lobbied through things. And so part of it was that actually we wanted people who were at home that couldn't get to venues, that couldn't be at conferences. I mean, with the pandemic, it's kind of everybody now. But when we sort of started the project, we felt like so many of our friends are not able to go to gigs or able to be at events, that we wanted them to have some power as well. So the idea of the Twitter was that they could actually steer the gig by putting comments in, like, you know, bigger, louder, less harp, or make an explosion, or stop playing, or whatever, so that our friends who probably have the least amount of power in their day-to-day lives would actually be influencing us, and it wouldn't be just, you know, me who has a little bit of academic backing and funding bids kind of telling everybody what to do, but kind of getting that door open, hearing things once the door was open. But I didn't explain that properly, and so we didn't get that bit going. But we're still kind of struggling with setup, because I think it became really obvious listening to other people's work that they're so much more kind of technically competent than our ensemble. And you know, this is the first time that Sonia's played live or done anything electronic. She's a clarinet player, and with Clarence, you know, he's never live streamed with his sound set directly rooted. So we've had to really kind of support people through every step, and we're still getting to a point where we know how to get all the windows open on the screen and know who's leading what, and it's kind of a work in process, and we have to work in little tiny chunks and figure stuff out, and then support the learners to kind of to go that next step with their practice. So yeah, but it's kind of about dispersing that power, I guess. That's why we wanted to use Twitter. Yeah.
No, it's fascinating, and it just quickly, it turned out that question was from Sophie, the one who I was thinking.
Okay, thanks, Sophie.
Because that's kind of, it sort of, and you sort of touched on a little bit actually in some of your answer to Sophie's question. I was wondering about how explicit your responses to tweets are. Now, of course, if you're saying things like it's play louder or play more of this or less of that, then obviously, because what I was curious about was kind of, is it your intention then that the people who tweet you those instructions can then hear the response or hear your response to it? Now, of course, if it's an explicit thing like play louder, play softer, play faster, play slower, yes, of course, they're more likely to they're going to pick that up. But if they're more kind of oblique kind of suggestions, or if you take a more oblique kind of response to them, that's kind of, I like the idea of, I think, I mean, because what we're doing is fascinating, but I think I would find it kind of fascinating if I was to kind of tweet you something and to hear something and find myself thinking, was that in response to the thing I said, or was that not? And the kind of ambiguity of that. So the kind of blurring kind of who's doing what and who's kind of responsible, for want of a better word, for what, is fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I think we're very open to that. And one of the things we wanted to do with the opera was to have a kind of hashtag like disability is, and then people can respond to that. So disability is da 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 da, and then those tweets then influence the performers as in real time. So like sometimes Steph is responding to the rhythms, and Sonia, they're responding to the rhythms of the speech. Sometimes they're responding to the ideas that the text gives them, and sometimes it's the pictures. So again, with the tweets, like you say, it could be completely unclear as to whether what you've said has influenced things or not, or whether it's just been very specific and like more this and more that. But I think again, it's about handing the power over and saying, you know, whatever you give us, we will listen to that and give you something back. Whether it's clear what we're giving you is another question.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Were there any more, or do we need to kind of move on? I'm conscious of just kind of trying to keep things so we have a little bit of time. We'll move on to Mark and Anne, if that's okay. Amber, thank you again.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Thank you for having us.
Comment from Mark. Oh, it's not Mark. Your Mark. What am I doing? Comment from Grant. Hang on. I'm going to pop that into the window, into the chat thing. Hang on. Here we go. Grant says this. Grant says, Mark, what an amazing range of sounds. I, for a while, thought you were all in the same room for the latest slow jazzy piece. Great sound quality, I suppose rather costly though. And there's a question from Shelley. Hang on. I'm not sure I caps the whole thing. There we go. Right. Shelley's question was, beautiful piece and great to see the many facets of accessibility being discussed. I might put that in. No, that's, yes, I am in there. Hang on, confusing myself, sorry. Where did that question go? Okay, sorry, Sophie. Sophie's offering to pop the question. Is it? Yes, Sophie, that would be great. Sorry, thank you. I'm confusing myself hopping between. I've got my laptop over there, my iPad in front of me. So sorry, so Shelley's question then was, I wonder if you had any bandwidth issues connecting to musicians on non-institutional network connections, which I believe has been an issue for high quality jack like audio streaming before, and how you adjusted to that if needed.
Yeah, well, like I said, a lot of people have been spending a lot of time working on these issues. So for instance, we had Elizabeth Baker come and sit in on one of our concerts, and we had no idea whether she had the bandwidth for it. And so we invited her, and then we asked her what her bandwidth was. We have everyone do a bandwidth check, and it was pretty low. It was pretty low, but it worked. So There's just a lot of what you have to do. You have a trade-off between latency and bandwidth. So you can keep the quality up just by increasing the latency a bit. And in fact, there's a jazz pianist who does a lot of professional gigs where he has jack trips set up so that he has two sets of a jack trip. Actually, it's built in now, so you only need one. But the idea was he was listening to a very, very deprecated audio sound so that he could keep the latency low. But the sound that he actually put out to the audience was the high quality one, because it didn't matter if that was a bit latent. So he could keep the latency very, very low just by keeping the audio quality down, just so that he could interact with the musician. And then, he would then broadcast the high quality one. So there are tricks like that you learn. And people have learned it, and they've actually built that into Jack Trip now, just because everyone's been working on this together. I don't know, Joe. I want Joe to jump in if he has anything to say. One thing we did was we just emailed a lot of people and said, "You want to try it?" So we tried it with a lot of different types of connections, and we just got good at figuring out ways to deal with it. Do you have anything to say about that, Joe?
Well, I came to the group totally as a newcomer in this sort of playing, and you guys really guided me through. There were things where it was just, there's so much of this process is just remembering what to do with your interface, remembering your settings, writing things down, getting that sort of process together. And then remembering, there's some box somewhere in the software that you have to move to 50 to 70 every time. And if you forget it, the whole thing might come crashing down. So there's a lot of, there's so much of that prep that has to go into making these things successful. But it's worth it.
Yeah, that's right. We've spent just hundreds of hours, and also there are people, again, all over the world who will answer your questions. You'll say, "I can't get this to work," and they will sit there and help you. There are people who have helped hundreds of people get, or I should say probably dozens of people get connected in this way. So it's become a global effort, and it's one that people are not being asked to be being compensated for. So it's really a great community in that way. Let's see.
Question just popped up from Shelley. It's saying, are those strategies that you mentioned documented online somewhere? It seems like that would be a great resource.
Yeah, there's a lot of documentation. If you check the Jack Trip Foundation, they will send you, it's jacktripfoundation.org or something like that. They'll send you to a lot of different resources. Michael Deason is one of the people at UC Irvine who has been doing this for a long time. We're setting up our own documentation now, finally, after having done it for a while, so that anyone can come on and do it. But also, people can feel free to email me if they have questions. And again, you go to Jack Trip. Jack Trip has its own user group that is referenced on jacktrip.org, and there are lots of people on there that will answer your questions also. Again, it's a really good group. We use a variation of Jack Trip for the most part. We do use Jack Trip, but we use Miller Puckett's variation just because it's easier for to get people started with. But I will say that I think a lot of the institutions we work for have really missed the boat on this whole pandemic thing, and I don't want to get too political with it, but I think that there were a lot of resources that could have gone into this type of thing that just did not, and so it's been up to a lot of people working, just to help each other out, and again, it's a great community in that way.
Just, I think, unfortunately, fascinating as this unquestionably is, we're going to need to keep going. Just to reiterate something that actually was brought up yesterday, and for people who weren't here yesterday, I'm going to just to kind of reiterate it now. Obviously, we have been keeping a tab of the questions that were asked for everybody across the whole conference, and we will, anything that we haven't been able to ask, we've actually all the questions that were posed in the chat window, whether we actually got to address them in the Q&A or not, we will be sharing those with everybody in due course, so you'll get to kind of have a bit of a look. But Mark, Anne, thank you once again. And if it's okay, then we will move on to Randall.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a couple questions up there. One from Grant.
Yes, hang on. Is Sophie on the case with it?
Down below,
yeah. Yes, Grant says, Randall, taking you as a self-confessed theorist, where do you, oh, hang on, something just moved. Yikes, hang on. Where did that go? There it is. Where do you really think that the IP space actually is? Sorry, a bit of a toughie. Great project. Thanks, says Grant.
Yeah, what is this indeterminate space? Yeah, I mean, obviously it's psychological in a sense. It's not. I mean, it doesn't really help us to try to think about where is this space situated. But it feels, from what I understand how they describe it, feels as if they're neither in Amsterdam or in Sweden, but they're not really in this sort of hyperspace in between. Like, what is it? They feel like they're in some sort of space that's cohesive, that's ecologically cohesive, but obviously conflicts with their perception of the actual physical acoustic space they're in. I mean, so as a theorist, someone who examines musicking from music cognition, kind of from ecological perspectives, I think it kind of disrupts their established ecologies and their gestural presences. Of course, I mean, I would talk for days about how everything comes down to gesture. So what it does is it generates in their gestural presence and consequently in their descriptions thereof, the metaphorical descriptions, their propositional language of how they describe this place as an indeterminate space. Interestingly, this wouldn't happen, I presume, if it were the original conception of the global hyperorgan, wherein you would only use acoustic sounds. So in that conception, what the performers say in Amsterdam, what they do would actually play the pipes in Sweden, and the performers in Sweden would play the pipes in Amsterdam, or an amalgam of the two. But all you would hear in one place are the pipes in that enclosed physical space that you're in. So you wouldn't have that perception. So it's something that is a product of the mix of acoustic and digital projected sound. Let's see. Yeah. There was another question up there from Alistair. I'll just read it.
Right, there was. Yes, go on, please do.
Oh, I see it right here. I can just read it. It says, watching the videos, I was struck by how much the ensemble appear to work together as an ensemble, which suggests their own processes of working. They work together with this hyper instrument, and they're surprised to have seen that the first test was in January. He asks, how could the ensemble have rehearsed with the organ in Amsterdam or any other of these extended organs? It's a good question. The ensemble existed before the global hyper organ. They've been doing work for I don't know how long, a couple of years or more, but working with their instrument there in Sweden for quite some time. So they're used to their collaborative cohesion and their collaboration with the pipes of an organ. But that question of rehearsing is a complex question for the global hyperorgan because it takes people, it takes time, it takes resources, it takes scheduling, which these organs, sometimes it's hard to find time with these spaces. The Orgel Park is usually crazy booked up. You can hardly get time in there because there are all these performances. And luckily, I mean, that's one fortunate side of the pandemic is that it's closed for official public performances. So it's wide open. But that was a problem with some of the other instruments getting access. But they did have rehearsal time. To answer your question, yes. They did set up time before, I think back in May. This performance was last week. So they've been rehearsing, or excuse me, that was a January performance. So they rehearsed back in December And they did have to schedule time. They had to have an engineer in each location. We have people who are quite familiar with the organs, the OSC protocols between the two. For the performance last week, we used Source Elements. Rebecca Wilson was actually on hand and created software specifically for the event. And we had an engineer from them on site in Amsterdam working with this, and somebody doing live video mixing at the same time, much as Mark's group was doing. But it takes a lot of planning, and the ultimate goal with the project is the next phase is to develop a unified software. So people can plug in online to the software and see and connect with the instruments in a very intuitive way, rather than having to kind of map them individually and then set up individual connections between the two. So the idea is to be a little more streamlined, so concert halls can have an event and could rehearse much more efficiently and set up the actual performance much more efficiently, dialing in through this this global system. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, it's a necessary complication of this.
Yeah. Alice says, many thanks. Yes, says Alistair. I think on that note, we're going to have to kind of wrap up the formal part of the Q&A and then open it up to just a more general discussion. Very quickly, I'm going to rattle through some thank yous, I think. Firstly, and of course it has to be firstly, thank you for everyone who's performed and presented their talks and their ideas over today and yesterday. It's been extraordinarily rich couple of days worth of discussion and topics, which I'm sure have given all of us a lot to think about. We are very grateful to the University of Wolverhampton, who have been amazing hosts. I've woken up at 5 a.m. this morning and yesterday morning in a blind panic about what might go wrong and what we'd forgotten. And the fact that none of those fears came to pass is very much down to them and their slick technical support. So that was Hope yesterday and Elena and Eleanor today. Folks, you've been amazing. Thank you for everything that you've done. The War Musicalisation, the RMA, for the support that we get from them as well as an RMA study group. Thank you to everyone who submitted a proposal. We're sorry that we couldn't include more of them. To everyone who's asked questions and kind of engaged in the discussion. We very much hope that all of this has kind of contributed to the discussion, the debate about where we are now, how the circumstances that we found ourselves in as a result of the pandemic have been impacted on what it is that we do, and how all of this might inform where we go from here. We will be at the RMA conference in Newcastle with more on all of this in September for anyone that will be around. So to sign off on behalf of all of us at Music Learners Process, which is Sophie Louisa Stone, Richard Glover, Alistair Giles, John Hales and myself, thank you so much for everything the last 2 days. It's been an absolute joy to have you with us, and let's open up an open discussion. Anyone who has any ideas, observations, comments they'd like to kind of throw open into the mix, please feel free. Now is the time. We'd love to hear it.